Hi there, welcome once again to the Tech Choice Bootcamp, the UI UX design track. And this is Module 8, where we'll be talking about low fidelity prototypes. In this module, I'll be introducing you to what low fidelity prototypes are. I'll be giving you the basics of the UI design guidelines, and I'll be introducing you also to the Android and iOS design guidelines. And finally, I'll be introducing you to Figma. Alright, so what is low fidelity designs? Low fidelity prototypes are early visual representation or first iteration of the product. They help designers to quickly check feasibility and test functionalities. A low fidelity prototype can take a variety of forms, from a series of rough paper sketches, each intended to represent an individual screen or a state of the app, to a fully interactive yet still somewhat basic wireframe simulation of the software. However, while low fidelity prototyping offers numerous advantages, it won't be the right choice for everyone all of the time. Okay, so the attributes of a low fidelity prototype is some of the visual attributes of the final product are actually represented, then there are limited content, and the prototype can be made interactive by linking wireframes to each other. And now there are benefits to low fidelity prototypes, which in short form is lo-fi. First, it enables designers to communicate design concepts before designing high-fi, which is high fidelity prototypes. They are inexpensive to make, they are fast to design, and changes can be made quickly. They require basic skills, and they promote collaboration among the team members. But anything in this life that has a pro must have a con. So the disadvantage of low fidelity prototypes are um, a low fidelity prototype puts the responsibility of creative imagination on the user, and unfortunately, just as some people cannot imagine themselves living in a house unless they see it fully furnished and ready to move in, some people also lack the imagination to envision how a finished app might look merely from viewing a low fidelity mockup. While it is often surprising how much functionality can be communicated via even the most basic low-fi prototypes, clearly there is a limit to the kind of technical specification that can be effectively simulated by a means of paper and pen alone. Indeed, more complex transitions, interactions, and animations will not be easily understood when viewed using such a low fidelity tool. Low fidelity prototypes are lacking in design details and interactivity, therefore only limited testing is possible. Users will need a lot of imaginations to understand the designs. Now we move to UI design guidelines. UI design guidelines are best practices for developing features that enhance the usability and attractiveness of the product. Here are a list of UI design guidelines, and we'll be talking about them one after the other. The first is usability heuristics, and the next is Gestalt's principles, followed by Hicks law, then Miller's law, then the von Restorff effect, and the aesthetic usability effect. The usability heuristics are basic rules of thumbs, best practices, or guidelines to consider when designing an interface. They include the visibility of system states, the match between system and the real world, the user control and freedom, consistency and standards, error prevention, recognition rather than recall, flexibility and efficiency of use, aesthetic and minimalistic design, and help user recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors, and help and documentation. But we'll be focusing on three of them, which is visibility of system states, recognition rather than recall, aesthetic, and minimalist design. Now, visibility of system status. The design should always keep users informed about what is going on through appropriate feedback within a reasonable amount of time. When users know the current system status, they learn the outcome of their prior interactions and determine next steps. Predictable interaction creates trust in the product as well as the brand. For example, on the picture we can see, the user should know what is going on inside the system. This is appropriate. This is achieved by giving appropriate feedback for an action within a reasonable time. The feedback can be provided showing a progress bar or a loader. And tips to enhance visibility of system status include: you need to communicate clearly to the user what the system state is. No action with consequence to users should be taken without informing them. Then present them with feedbacks as quickly as possible and build trust through open and continuous communication. The next is recognition rather than recall. Minimize the user's memory load by making elements, actions, and options visible. The user should not have to remember information from one part of the interface to another. Information required to use the design, for example, field labels or menu items, should be visible and easily retrievable when needed. Humans have limited short-term memories. Interfaces that promote recognition reduce the amount of cognitive effort required from the user. Information required to use the product, for example, field labels like what we can see on the screen, should be visible or easily retrievable when needed. And tips to increase recognition rather than recall is: you let the people recognize information in the interface rather than having them remember it. Offer help in context instead of giving users a long tutorial to memorize. Then reduce the information that the users have to remember. Then the next one is aesthetic and minimalist design. Interfaces should not contain information which is irrelevant or rarely needed. Every extra unit of information in an interface competes with the relevant units of information and diminishes their relative visibility. This erase state doesn't mean you have to use a flat design. It's about making sure you are keeping the content and visual design focused on the essentials. Ensure the visual elements of the interface support the user's primary goal and objective. The tips to keep aesthetics and minimalist design is: you need to keep the content and visual design of the UI focused on the essentials, like this, where you just need the email address and the password and the login button and a sign up. That's all. You don't need any extra feature. Then don't let unnecessary elements distract the users from the information they really need, and prioritize the content and features to support primary goals. Now we move to Gestalt. Sorry, there's an error there. Gestalt principles. First off, what do we mean by Gestalt? Gestalt is a group of visual perception. It's actually a German word. It's a group of visual perception principles provided by a German psychologist in the 1920s. It is built on the theory that an organized whole is perceived as a greater than the sum of its parts. Now we are going into principles and laws, because there are laws guiding UI and UX designs. So this is the first one, and more or less the simplest. The Gestalt principle attempts to describe how people perceive visual elements when certain conditions apply. Gestalt principles are visual perception and laws that they are visual perception laws that describe how the human brain groups similar elements, recognizes patterns, and simplifies sample images. They are built on 4 key ideas, which is the first is emergence. People tend to identify elements first in their general outline form. Then our brain recognizes a simple, well-defined object quicker than a detailed one. Then there's reification. People can recognize objects even when there are parts of them missing. Our brain matches what we see with familiar patterns stored in our memory and fills in the gaps. Okay. Then multi-stability. People will often interpret ambiguous objects in more than one ways. Our brains will bounce back and forth between the alternatives, seeking certainty. As a result, one view will become more dominant while the other will get harder to see. Then there is invariance, sorry. People can recognize simple objects independently of their rotation, scale, and translation. Our brain can perceive objects from different perspectives despite their different appearances. So here are the Gestalt principles which can inform today's UI designs. The principles include proximity, similarity, continuation, closure, figure slash ground, figure or ground. They make content user interface aesthetically pleasing and easy to understand. Now move to proximity. Proximity refers to how close elements are to one another. The strongest proximity relationships are those between overlapping subjects, but just grouping objects into a single area can also have a strong proximity effect. The opposite is also true, of course. By putting space between elements, you can add separation even when their other characteristics are the same. For example, with what you can see on the screen, the first object and the second object, they are close to each other and they are perceived to be related. The next is similarity. It is human nature to group like things together. In Gestalt, similar elements are visually grouped regardless of their proximity to each other. They can be grouped by color, shape, or size. Similarities can be used to tie together elements that might not be right next to each other in a design. Elements can be visually grouped if they have visual similarities. This can be applied in the form of color, shape, or iconography. The Add New Item button applies similarity by grouping, which is the Add New Item label and the plus icon. The next one is continuation. The law of continuity postulates that the human eye will follow the smoothest path when viewing lines, regardless of how the lines were actually drawn. This principle is applied when the interface is designed to guide the eye from one object to another. As you can see on the screen, there is a continuity in the number of cards, which has visually guided our eyes using the continuation rule that this object is linked to another. The next one is closure. Closure is one of the coolest Gestalt principles and one I already touched on at the beginning of this piece. It is the idea that your brain will fill in the missing parts of a design to create a whole one. In the simplest form, the principle of closure allows your eyes to follow something like a dotted line to its end. But more complex applications are often seen in logos, like that of the World Wildlife Fund. The large chunk of the outline of the panda are missing, but your brain has no problem filling in the missing sections to see the whole animal. Closure is quite often used in logo designs and with other examples including those for the US network, NBC, the Sun Microsystem, and even Adobe. Another very important example of closure at work in UX and UI design is when you show a partial image fading off the user screen, like we can see on the screen, in order to show them that there is more to be found if they swipe left or right. Without a partial image, that is, if no full image are shown, the brain doesn't immediately interpret that there might be more to be seen, and therefore our user is less likely to scroll. Individuals perceive objects such as shapes, letters, pictures, etc. as being whole when they are not complete. Specifically, when parts of the pictures are missing, our perception fills in the visual gap. Now we go to figure and ground. The figure ground principle is similar to closure principle in that it takes advantages of the way the brain processes negative spaces. You've probably seen an example of this principle floating around in memes on social media or as a part of logos. For example, the FedEx logo already mentioned. Your brain will distinguish between the objects it considers to be in the foreground of an image and the background. Where things get interesting is when the foreground and background actually contain two distinct images, like this on the screen. The principle is applied when layering, contrast, and information hierarchy are used to separate elements on different plane of focus. In general terms, your brain will interpret the larger area of an image as the ground and the smaller as the figure. As shown in the image we see, the image placeholder icon has a higher hierarchy relative to the gray background, making it the object of focus. The figure background principle can be very handy when product designers want to highlight a focal point, particularly when it is active or in use. For example, when a modal window pops up and the rest of the site fades into the background, or when a search bar is clicked and the contrast is increased between it and the rest of the website. User interface design isn't all about pretty pixels and sparkly graphics. It's mainly about communication, performance, and convenience. Gestalt principles are always currently helping us achieve these goals, creating a pleasant experience for the users and a great success for the business. In subsequent videos, we will be talking about the other laws guiding UI designs, and your lovely Figma will get there very soon. So that's all for me. That's all from me for this video, and we'll see you in the next video. Okay, thank you. Bye.